Okay, so we're live. Yes, thank you. Good evening. Thank you everybody for coming out. So this is devICT for Thursday the 28th. Quick, I just want to do a little bit about us. So if you're not familiar, devICT is a community for developers. Our mission is to educate, empower, and connect software developers in the Wichita area. And that's all kinds of software developers. A lot of us do web, but we also have people doing mobile or games or mainframe or hardware or just anything, hobby devs, like all sorts of developers. So if you do software development in the greater Wichita area, then we would like you to be involved. So before we move on, we do have a code of conduct that we take seriously. We're dedicated to a safe and harassment-free experience for everyone. If you have any questions or concerns, please just talk to me. Our full code of conduct is on our website, devict.org. Where's Tanner? Do you see Tanner? Go get him. Go ahead. No. Okay. I just want to highlight a couple ways that you could get involved in the community. The number one way is to chat on Slack. If you're not already in there, just go to devict.org, click on chat up at the top, and it'll give you a form where you can get an invite to our Slack chat team. There's people in there pretty much every day. Another way to be involved is to watch the recordings of presentations that we've done. So like this is being recorded. Most of our presentations get recorded and we put them up there on our website, devict.org. Another way to be involved is to donate. Membership in our organization is free and most of our events are free. We do have some nominal monthly costs for server hosting or using the space here. That comes out to about $100 a month. And right now we have recurring donations of $106 a month. So we're still in the black, which is great. But if more smaller donations are great because then it's not so much burden on like any one large individual donation. Another way to be involved is to give a talk. Giving a talk at one of these events is a great way to, I think, to learn about something you're interested in. When you commit to talking about something in front of 4 to 10 to 30 people, I think that's a good motivator to actually go ahead and learn about that. Another thing is you could use these kind of events as practice for a talk you might want to give at like a regional or national or international conference, which is actually kind of the opposite of what we're going to experience tonight. The talk that we're going to see from Katie was given at DjangoCon, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's cool now we get our own local version. Another way to be involved is we have a mentorship program. If you go to devict.org/mentors, there's a list there where you can put in some topics that you're interested in, see if there's anyone who's volunteered to teach in that topic, and then try and get connected with them to work something out. If you're interested in becoming a mentor, just let me know, and I'll show you how to get your information on there. If you're looking to connect with a mentor, go check it out on the website, or just ask in Slack. We have, this list gets long, so I'm not going to cover it all, but we have a list of some groups that we want to give a shout out to. Make ICT, the Wichita's Maker Movement community. If you're not already familiar, you should definitely check them out, makeict.org. Women Who Code, Open Wichita. WULUG is the Wichita State Linux Users Group, but you don't have to be a Wichita State student to attend the events. That's worth checking out. Startup Wichita, Shocker Startup are two entrepreneurial events if you're interested in startup culture. Then we have Wichitalks, our quarterly Ignite talks, kind of like lightning talks, but cooler, a lot more production value. They're just a lot better. It's that guy. In case you wonder why that was weird. Other events that we have coming up, we have study hall every Monday night here at the Labor Party from 7 to 9. This is a dedicated time and place where you can come and just work on whatever you're doing. There's usually somebody there that can maybe help you or point you in the right direction. And we have Code and Coffee, which is the same kind of thing, but it's Thursday mornings. It starts sometime in the morning and just goes towards the afternoon. So it's a good opportunity for people to typically work on something before they go into like a day job. We have a social event, the Hangout, on every second Tuesday. Then on second Saturdays, we have a dev potluck here at the Labor Party again. Just you come and hang out and work on games or play games or whatever you want to do, and maybe bring food, maybe don't, just kind of whatever. We also do have presentations for the Java Talks event, which is on the third Tuesday of the month. That's over at the High Touch building. So it's not necessarily Java, it's just anything in the JVM ecosystem, like Scala, Kotlin, any of those. And then there's devICT Presents, which is what we're going to do tonight, last Thursday of every month. And before we move on, I want to detour for a second. And were you already going to talk about this later?
No.
Okay, so this weekend we'll point out, like in Slack, and we'll tweet it, there's going to be a link to the Wichita Hacktoberfest event. So if you may be familiar, just a minute. Every year, DigitalOcean and GitHub do an event called Hacktoberfest. So it's during the month of October. If you open 4 pull requests to any GitHub repositories, any open source thing on GitHub, then you get a t-shirt. So it's just for fun. And we are now doing we started last year, and this year we're putting more effort into it. We're doing our own Wichita version of Hacktoberfest. So it's the same time, so you can get 2 shirts, get the local one and get the national one at the same time. But the idea is just if you can contribute 4 things to Wichita-based projects. And we have a whole application for that where we can keep track of which ones are in Wichita, which ones are not, and we'll be putting a link out to that this weekend. So before we can go any further on that, let's give a round of applause for Katie Michael, who's going to talk about Jumpstart on collaboration and code review.
Will you help me get my speaker notes?
First, let's do that. Go here, here, here. This over here, and then this one needs to go full screen.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be here and meet some of you. I've been lurking in the Slack channel for a while, but this is actually my first time to come to a devICT event, so I'm really thrilled. I'm going to be talking to you today about things that I learned as the DjangoCon US website chair, and I'm also a DEFNA board member. And my goal in this talk is that I want to get you started collaborating and doing code review as quickly as possible. I'm going to show you a lot of screenshots and diagrams because I want you to understand what the process looks like, because that was one of the things I struggled with when I was learning. But if you happen to miss anything, at the end of my talk, there will be a slide with a link to a repo in my GitHub user account that will have all of my slides and notes and all the commands that I'm going to use and some really useful links. Firstly, I want to tell you how I got started with open source contribution because I think it shows that there are some fun and interesting ways to get involved. I created my GitHub account back in 2013, and my account actually sat unused for about 7 months because I didn't know how to get started. And one day I happened to be looking at Twitter, and this man named Dan Sinker had a really delicious taco meal, and he decided to create a project on GitHub to collaborate in sharing taco recipes. So I followed the link to the project to take a look, and there was actually one sentence that had a really huge impact on my life. And the sentence was, "Are you new to GitHub but want to contribute?" Well, that was exactly my situation, and I became extremely determined to contribute to his project, and I did. I actually submitted my first pull request to that project. I kept getting better at Git and GitHub, and eventually I became a DjangoCon US website contributor in 2016, and then in this year I became the website chair and a maintainer, and I'm going to use the DjangoCon US website repo as an example project in my talk, but actually what I'm going to tell you, you can directly apply to the projects that you're eligible to use for Wichita Hacktoberfest. Firstly, here are a few prerequisites. You need to have a free GitHub account. You might not need to work locally, but I highly recommend that you learn to do it. You would need to have Git installed on your computer and set your email and username, and it would be helpful if you can find and open your command line and navigate it a bit, and I'm going to have a few bash commands later that can help you with that. You might also want to have a text editor of your choice installed, and there's some documentation in the useful resources section at the end of my talk. Firstly, what are Git and GitHub? GitHub is a website built on the version control software Git. GitHub is a social network. You can make a user profile and follow people and follow their activity in your newsfeed and find interesting projects. But probably the most important thing about GitHub is that you can collaborate with other people to work on code in repositories. For example, if you go to the DjangoCon US organization account, you'll see a list of repos, and one of the repos is the DjangoCon US website repo. And if you click on the hyperlink, it will open up the repo, and you'll see the files and folders with the website code, and you can look through it and learn from it and contribute to it. But when you're working on code, you can't do everything in the GitHub website. For example, when I'm working on the DjangoCon US website, I sometimes want to have a copy of the code in my local development environment on my computer, and I need to have some special software installed, and I might want to run the code in my local browser so that I could create a feature or test a pull request branch. And this is where Git is very useful because it's installed in your local development environment, and you use it in the command line of your computer. And you can actually use it to make a snapshot of your project at any point in time, and you can revert back to that if you want to. So here's a screenshot of my local development environment, and in the background I have GitHub open in the browser, and in front of that I have my local folder window in my command line. And just to give you an idea of what we're trying to do here, you can take the web address from a GitHub repo in the command line, and you can use it to create a copy of the repo in your local development environment. This is called cloning. You can then make changes to the files and push the changes back to GitHub, and meanwhile, other people will be doing the same thing on their computers, and I'm going to elaborate on that process later. But I want to tell you a concept that I think is really important in terms of increasing your level of responsibility. And in my opinion, part of that, you need to begin to be able to switch between multiple tasks, which gives you more freedom. For instance, you might want to keep your main code branch up to date, and you might want to work on one or more features and do code review, and these are things you could do intermittently. When I first started using GitHub, it was pretty common that I would go into my GitHub account into a repo, and I would click on the pencil icon to open a file, and I would make a change and save it. And this is fine, but imagine if you had multiple people working on the same files and they were all making changes like this. It wouldn't be very practical. For instance, how would you give feedback? There's actually a better way to make changes that will enable you to switch between multiple tasks the way that you need to collaborate and do code review. And the way to do that is to use branches. They're a best practice, and any GitHub user can use them. So for example, when you create a repo, by default, you're working in a branch named master. So for instance, if you want to make a change in the master branch, you can make a copy of the entire master branch and give it a new name. And now there are two branches in the same repo. There's a master branch and a feature branch. And by the way, GitHub often refers to feature branches as topic branches. You can create an unlimited number of branches, and you can switch in between them to work on them. And at some point, when the feature branch author thinks it's done, they can submit a pull request, and the feature branch becomes a pull request branch. And if the changes are accepted, they're merged into the master branch. So now the master branch is like before, except it has the changes integrated into it. And something I'm going to talk about a little bit later is that feature branches and pull request branches are just examples of branches, and you can work on them in much the same way. let's go back to the screenshot of editing a file in GitHub. There is a radial button at the bottom that you can choose to indicate that you want to create a new branch, and there's a place to give it a new name. And when you click save, you're not saving your changes in the file, you're saving your changes in a newly created branch. You can also create and work on branches through the command line in your local development environment, and I'm going to show you how to do that later. In the rest of my talk, these are the things we're going to go over. We're going to determine which collaboration approach to use. We're going to clone a repo into our local development environment, create a feature branch, make a change, push the branch to the GitHub repo we cloned from, and submit a pull request to the DjangoCon US website repo. Then we are going to review the two different types of pull requests as a DjangoCon US website repo maintainer. Then I'll have some practical commands and additional workflow info, and then I'll have some recommendations based on my own experience. Firstly, let's determine which collaboration approach to use. There is a fancy term, collaborative development model, and it basically just means how people work on code together. There are two different models. There is the shared repository model and the fork and pull model, and typically the two different models correspond to the two different type of account types, and which model you use depends on whether or not you have write permission to the repo. There are two types of accounts, an organization account such as DjangoCon organization, and a user account such as my own personal user account. When we talk about write permission, we're not talking about write like in the context of English. When a user has write permission to a repo, it means that they can go directly into the repo and make changes to it. They could, for instance, edit files. They can push branches directly to the repo instead of through a fork. I'm going to talk about what a fork is in a minute. And they can merge and pull and close pull requests. In the useful resources section, there is an article from the GitHub help section, and it's about repository permission levels for an organization. And I recommend looking at the chart in that because that will actually break down what you can do based on what permission you have. This is why we need write permission. The DjangoCon US website is deployed live from the master branch, and it has a pretty high level of traffic depending on type of year. We wouldn't want just anybody to be able to go into the repo and make a change because they could actually damage the repo, for instance. And there's often a level of trust involved in having write permission. Let's look at a couple examples of write permission and collaboration. First, we'll look at the shared repository model. A shared repository is typically found in an organization account, which makes sense when you think of the word shared. For example, when I became a maintainer of the DjangoCon US website, I was given write permission to the repo, which is a shared repository. So along with the other maintainers who also have write permission, I can make changes directly in the repo. The fork and pull model is typically found in user accounts. For example, when I first came across the DjangoCon US website repo, I wanted to contribute, but I wasn't a maintainer, so I didn't have write permission. So what I could do is make a copy, which is also known as a fork, of the DjangoCon US website repo into my own user account where I have write permission to all of the repos. So then I would make a change and submit a pull request to the DjangoCon US website repo. This is how you fork a repo. You, for example, go to the DjangoCon US website repo. You could click the fork button, or if you go to a repo that you do not have write permission to and you attempt to edit a file, GitHub will automatically fork the repo for you. And I think they actually changed this process a bit recently. But anyway, basically, you usually get some kind of message notifying you that the repo is being forked, and that will lead you back to your own user account. And there will now be an entry for the fork. And it will say it's a fork, and it will say where it came from. And you can click on the hyperlink and open the repo. And the repo URL will have your user account name in it. The repo will be an exact copy of the original repo at the time it was forked. And you can basically make any change to it, including deleting it, without affecting the original repo. And in addition to that, you don't necessarily have to fork a repo just to submit a pull request, though. Depending on what the license is, you could also fork a repo to start a new project of your own. Now we're going to clone a repo into our local development environment, create a feature branch, make a change, push the branch to the GitHub repo we cloned from, and submit a pull request to the DjangoCon US website repo. I made a couple of diagrams that I hope will give you an idea of what the process is like working locally for either collaborative development model. For instance, for the fork and pull model, you fork the repo, and then you clone the fork into your local development environment, and Git will track some of the details about your project. For instance, it will know where your project came, what repo the code came from. In relation to the clone, the GitHub repo we cloned from is now known as a remote repo, and Git will assign the name origin to it. And we can now use the name origin in the command line to refer to the repo so that we can push and pull changes back and forth between the local development environment and the GitHub repo. We make our changes and we push the changes back to the fork and submit the pull request. Here's what it looks like when we use the shared repository model. The most important thing is that we don't need a fork because we have write permission. We can clone the shared repository directly into our local development environment, and the shared repository is our remote origin. We make our changes, push the changes back to the shared repository, and submit the pull request. I want to just mention these bash commands to you because you do need to know a few of these to be able to navigate the files in your local development environment. The command line helps you to communicate directly with your operating system. I think, though, that these would be enough for you to be able to get started. And I do want to point out that there are some Git tasks that vary by operating system. I don't think there will be much of a difference in my talk, but in the GitHub help articles, there are some tabs at the top of some of the articles that will you can click on to get information for different operating systems. For instance, my operating system uses the $sign as the command prompt, and some other operating systems use something else, for instance. Also, I want to point out that I've used, I put directory name in little carets. That indicates that it's a variable. That's something that's going to be replaced by the real thing. So CD, you can use that to go back to your home directory. You can use CD and directory name to change directory. Directory is basically just a folder on your computer. You can move back a directory by using CD ... and you can list the folders and files in a directory by using ls. And you can use these commands such that you wouldn't even need to look through your folders if you didn't want to visually look through them. What I'm going to show you now is a generic process that you can use for either a shared repository or a fork. It doesn't matter which one. You are just cloning the repository you have write permission to. We'll go back to the screenshot of my local development environment. I'm working in my home directory, and I can tell that because the name of it is at the top of the command line and in front of the command prompt. The reason why this matters is because when you clone, you are cloning the repo into the directory you are working in. And I'm going to type the command git clone into the command line and copy and paste the URL from the browser of either the shared repo or fork and then hit enter. A folder will appear in my home directory by the same name as the GitHub repo. In this case, it's 2017.djangocon.us, and it will be filled with the contents of the repo. I now have a copy of the code in GitHub and a copy in my local development environment. I will change directory into the folder so that I can work there. So I'll type cd 2017.djangocon.us, which is the folder name. I've clicked on the folder in the folder window so that I can see the contents visually, but I can also see that I'm working in that folder because the name of it is at the top of my command line and in front of my command prompt. If you were to pull up your GitHub repo and also your local folder window and compare the files, you would see, some of the corresponding files, although the format will be slightly different because The files in GitHub are being rendered in a browser, whereas the files locally are more like raw files. You can use the command git branch to verify which branch you are checked out on. And initially, you'll be checked out on the default branch, which in this case is master branch. We will now create and check out. Checkout means switch to a feature branch. We're going to call it example branch. We want to branch off of the branch we intend our changes to be merged into. And this is something really useful to know because I did not understand this when I started working locally. The local files switch to the files of the branch you're checked out on. And when you first make, when you first create a branch, it's a copy of another branch. If you make a change in it and switch between the branches, you'll see the difference. At this point, you could open a file in the text editor, make a change and save it, add and commit your change to Git version control and create a message. This is kind of a generic one. You'd probably want to use a more specific message. Now we can push the new branch, named example branch, to GitHub to our origin, whichever repo we cloned from that we have write permission to. If you go to your origin, there will now be a new branch in the repo, and there will be a message telling you it's there. The branch is not really affecting anything else. If you click on the branch tab, you can choose the name of the branch to switch to the new branch. And you can toggle back and forth between the branches by clicking on the branches in the branches tab. Now, when you go to submit the pull request, you want to go to the repo that you want your pull request to be merged into, because you can actually submit a pull request to yourself, and GitHub will let you do it. In this case, we'd want to go to the DjangoCon US website repo, and there will be a similar message there because it will detect the branch and it will suggest that you submit a pull request. And you will click on the compare and pull request button. Make sure that the base branch is the branch you want your change to be merged into. Make sure the compare branch is your branch. Create a title and perhaps a description. If the pull request is from a fork, there's going to be a box checked by default giving maintainers the ability to edit your pull request. Double check your changes and click create pull request. Now we're going to review the two different types of pull requests as a DjangoCon US website repo maintainer. I think this part is very interesting because when I asked to be a maintainer and started doing it, it was totally a mystery to me what happened. How people did that. I literally had no idea. When a pull request is submitted, the repo maintainers will receive a notification by email or in the browser letting them know about the pull request. They will have a link they can follow to the pull request tab in the browser. They look over the information given about the pull request, like the title and the description, and there will be a link named Files Changed that they can click on, and there will be like a little summary of the changes made that they can look over. Underneath that, there will be information about how to merge the pull request. There will be a merge button that you can use, that you can click to merge in the browser, and there will be a link that says command line instructions. When you click on that link, it opens up a set of instructions for how to review and merge the pull request in your local development environment. These instructions are different depending on whether the pull request was submitted through a fork or through the shared repo. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. But first, let's look at the options of what you can do when you review a pull request. The first two options are the simplest. They involve just clicking merge without running the code locally. You might look at the pull request and be able to just see that it's acceptable and click merge. Or you might look at it and there's just some small change that needs to be made. And similarly to how we edited a file earlier, you can click on a pencil icon and open the pull request file and just edit, like a typo for instance, and click save and click merge. The other options involve fetching the pull request into your local development environment and running the code there. If you do that and a change does not need to be made, you could go back to the browser and click merge. If a change needs to be made, you could do a few different things. Probably the most common would be to ask the pull request author to make a change to the pull request. But you yourself can also add to the pull request. You can, for instance, make changes locally yourself and then push the additional commits to the branch on GitHub. Or you could make changes yourself locally, and you could locally merge the branch with the branch it's intended to be merged with locally, and push the changes to the branch on GitHub, which will automatically close the pull request. This is why the pull request instructions are different. I think this is really interesting. As a DjangoCon US website maintainer, I can fetch updates made to the DjangoCon US website repo into a hidden folder named .git in my local development environment. These updates will include branches made directly to the DjangoCon US website repo. They will not include branches that were made through a fork because they came from outside the origin. Branches made through a fork have to be pulled individually into your local development environment. And by the way, we're going to talk about git fetch in a couple minutes, and it will be useful to know that when you do git fetch origin to fetch the update, the branches in the .git folder are known as remote tracking branches, and they're referred to as the remote name / branch name. Now, I mentioned earlier that feature branch and pull request branches can be worked on in the same way. I think it's a bit misleading when they say pull request instructions, because the instructions on this slide, which are basically the generic pull request instructions they give you, these can actually be used by any maintainer who has write permission to a branch. If a pull request has already been made, the additional commits are added to the pull request up to the point that the pull request is merged and closed. For a shared repository pull request, we use the command git fetch origin to fetch the updates into the .git folder. We create and check out to a new local branch, which we give a name to, and we insert the pull request branch contents from the .git folder into the new local branch by referring to the branch by the remote tracking syntax origin / branch name. We can merge master to make sure the master is up to date. And if, like I said, if we make a change, we can push additional commits to the branch on GitHub. For a pull request submitted through a fork, we create a new branch off master and pull in the contents of the pull request branch from the fork. If we make a change, we can also push additional commits if we have been given permission to edit the pull request. That was back when, you know, you're submitting a pull request and there's a little default box that is checked. This is the piece of code for merging a pull request locally and pushing to the master branch. It's the same for either situation. We're checking out the master branch, merging the feature branch into the master branch, then pushing the change to the live master branch on GitHub. After the pull request is closed, it's good practice to delete the pull request branch locally and in the browser. There will be a button in the pull request page that you can click to delete the branch, or you can go to the branches tab and delete the branch there. The first two commands would be for deleting the branch locally. The second one has a larger D, has a capital D, because you can, that's for if you need to force delete. Sometimes you need to use that. For instance, if you haven't merged the branch, GitHub might make you do that. The third command is so that you can delete a branch in the browser from your command line. These are some things I'm not covering, but it's good to be aware of these if you want to further your knowledge. Rebase and interactive rebase has to do with reordering your commits so that your commits are the last commits. Squashing means that you're taking several different pull requests and putting them together so it appears to be one commit. Merge conflicts are if two different developers have made the same change in a file. You have to decide which change to accept. Aliases are like nicknames for commands to make it easier to use your command line. You can also fetch individual pull request branches, and I put a command for that for fun in the useful resources section. I'm going to give you some practical commands and additional workflow info. This is actually some material that I added after my DjangoCon talk because I think it's really important, but I'm still working out how to explain it. Firstly, I want to point something out. When I showed you how to make a branch locally and make a change to it, I did specifically tell you to do add and commit. You're going to be using this a lot. Anytime you make a change to a file locally, at some point you need to add and commit the change to version control. And earlier, I did not specifically say this when I talked about if you're working on a pull request and you make a change and you push the change, but you would be using something like this very, very often. Earlier, I used git add dot and git commit dash m your note, but there are many variations. For instance, you could also combine those two commands and do git commit dash am your note. And now I want to talk about manual updates. When you make an update somewhere, like for instance, in the DjangoCon US website repo, if an update happens and someone has forked the repo, their fork does not automatically update with the change. You have to manually update your code, whether it be in the shared repository or fork or locally. There are two ways to manually update. One way is along the lines of what we did earlier when we fetched, did git fetch origin. You can git fetch and git merge, or you can git pull, which is a combination of git fetch and git merge in one command. When we used git fetch a few minutes ago, we were fetching updates to review a pull request. In that situation, we were creating a new branch and inserting the contents of the pull request remote tracking branch into it. This situation is a little bit different because we are fetching the updates from a remote. It could be the origin, but it could be another one, which I'll talk about in a minute. We're checking out a local branch that already exists and merging the up-to-date remote tracking branch into the local branch to update it. The alternative is to run git pull. And in this scenario, we also need to be checked out to the local branch. Because we are fetching and merging at the same time, we do not need to use the remote tracking branch syntax of the remote name / branch name because it's automated. We use git pull and then the remote name and a space and the branch name instead. I think this is a really important slide for people who are new to contribution, who are learning to work locally. This is an example of syncing a forked repo clone. Say, for instance, like I said, a maintainer makes a change in the DjangoCon US website repo. The fork does not automatically update. We could delete the fork and refork it to update, which might be okay. But if you have a pull request pending and you delete the fork, the pull request is now considered inactive, and it makes it harder for you and the maintainers to work on it. So here's a way to update the fork instead. We already know that the fork automatically becomes the remote origin when the remote is cloned locally, when the repo is cloned locally. We can add an additional remote to the local clone that points to the shared repo. The remote in this situation of a forked repo clone, the remote is from the shared repo is commonly called Upstream. We can then fetch and merge or pull updates from the upstream to the local clone, then push updates to the fork. And we are not pushing to the upstream because presumably we do not have write permission to it. In the case of syncing a shared repo clone, we have write permission to the shared repo, so we don't need a fork. We can fetch and merge or pull updates from the shared repo, which is our remote origin, to the local clone and push updates back to the shared repo. This is the generic code to add a remote upstream to a forked repo clone. You're doing git remote add and the remote name and the remote URL. So in this situation, we do git remote add upstream and the URL to the shared repo. And you can verify it worked by running git remote -v. Here are a few generic commands. For pushing and pulling, we check out the branch, then pull or push using the remote name or remote URL and branch name. For fetching and merging, we fetch the updates from the remote, check out the local branch we want to update, and merge the remote tracking branch into the local branch. So here are a couple really common syncing scenarios. In the first scenario, you are a maintainer of a shared repo. You fetch the updates from the origin, which is the shared repo. You check out the local master branch and merge the remote tracking branch master into the local branch master. In the second scenario, you are working from a clone of a fork. You fetch the updates from the upstream, which is the shared repo. You check out the local master branch, merge the remote tracking branch master into your local branch master. And this is the different part. You push the updates to the master branch of your fork, which is your origin. And here's another useful scenario. Say, for instance, you have updated your local branch master. We might want to check out a feature branch and merge either the newly updated master branch into it, or you could merge the remote tracking branch master branch into it instead, which is the same difference. In the last scenario, instead of fetching and merging, we are checking out the local master branch and pulling and pushing to and from the origin master branch. I want to point out something, and that is that the workflow that I've been using is basically GitHub flow. And it consists of merging pull requests into the master branch, which, for instance, in the case of DjangoCon US website, deploys directly to the live site. But some projects use both a master and a developed branch. For instance, if you are working on a project that is, mission critical with a really high volume of users, you might want to merge your pull requests into a develop branch and have it deploy to a staging site so that you can test your changes. And if you like them, then perhaps you would merge the develop branch into the master branch, which would be perhaps deployed to a live production site. Well, I find this topic really interesting, and a lot of people are kind of passionate about what workflow they use. I don't think there really is a best workflow. It's really about what workflow fits your situation. If you want to know more about that, you could check out GitHub flow documents. There's a great article called A Successful Git Branching Model. There's another one that it's considered harmful. Also, Sumver is a really good resource. It has to do with semantic versioning. And Atlassian and GitLab are other platforms built on Git, and they also have some really good documentation to talk about workflows. And I do want to point out that if you have more than one branch, it does change how you set up your project and how you work on it. For instance, I have a few branch commands. The first one is if you check out a branch that already exists. In the second one, you check out and you create and check out a branch at the same time. In the third command, you are specifying which branch you're branching off of if you have more than one branch. I have a few recommendations. I highly recommend that you put effort into making your documentation really welcoming to contributions, that you make it really easy for people to understand how to do it, and that you're really positive about it because it can increase the number of contributions to your project and increase the diversity. In the useful resources section, I have links to the DjangoCon US website repo documentation that you can see as examples. And documentation is considered extremely useful, but it's quite often missing. But within that is an opportunity, because if you are starting out looking for pull requests to use to fulfill the requirements of Wichita Hacktoberfest, a really good way to get started is to find missing documentation and provide it. If you have the authority, it's a good idea to go into a repo settings and click on the branches tab and protect the main branch so it can't be deleted. When I was working on the DjangoCon US website, the first thing that I did was I submitted a pull request in the wrong way. You won't if you follow my instructions, but I accidentally deleted a really important branch. And the lesson was that it was no big deal because other people had the branch locally, and the person who had committed last could just push the branch. And even if there had been if the local branch had been deleted, it could have been retrieved from the .git folder. But anyway, it could save someone some panic. Some additional safety considerations: you might want to back up your repo through third-party software. You can enable required reviews of pull requests. Basically, instead of people being able to just go into a file and make a change, they have to submit a pull request and more than one person has to review it. You can use status checks like Travis CI. If needed, you can revert pull requests. And I did mention, as a worst case scenario, I've included an article if you need to recover a deleted branch. Sensitive data. If you accidentally commit sensitive data to version control, you should consider it compromised and just change it. Here are a few productivity helpers. Password caching, I would say, in my opinion, is the most important one. When you do password caching, you don't have to keep using your username and your email every time you push to GitHub in your command line. You can close issues using commit messages by using keywords. You can save replies to use when you're responding to issues, and you can link to specific line numbers on GitHub. This is a really important thing, triaging. When you look for issues to work on, I highly recommend, in terms of leveling up, that you find issues that have been triaged for your skill level so that you can work on things that you feel comfortable working on. You can search by tag to find projects that use triaging, and you can also do this if you become a maintainer, because when I became a maintainer for DjangoCon US website, there was a more senior level developer, and he would let me jump in and work on the easier pull requests, and he would deal with the harder ones. And it made it easier for me to learn the process. And I recommend that you practice your skills and workflow. Don't be afraid to delete and start over. You can also use your own account as a sandbox. I said earlier that you can accidentally submit a pull request in your own account, but you might want to create a repo and actually make a pull request yourself and then review the pull request yourself just to practice. And you can also use the help function. There's really great documentation from official GitHub help, or through the command line. I have a couple examples. There has been some keyboard shortcuts thing that doesn't work for me now, but maybe it can work for someone else where you type a question mark. These are some things, these are some myths. These are things I thought when I first started using GitHub, and I just want to throw these out there for people who might be afraid. I thought the repos looked perfect when I first started looking through repos. And actually, if you spend enough time on GitHub, you will start to see a lot of room for improvement. For instance, like I said, there are unlimited opportunities just starting with documentation. But I thought that the people working on GitHub projects must all be experts, which is not true. There are people of all types and all skill levels and knowledge levels contributing. I thought people seemed like they knew exactly what to do, and actually behind the scenes, it's a pretty messy place because people are self-organizing and debating, and there's a lot of creativity. I thought it was all about code, which isn't true. I showed that when I talked about how I got started contributing. And I thought I might break something. And I actually hear a lot of people say that they're afraid to get started, but Git is extremely resilient. And if you mess up, it's a learning opportunity. And usually my last recommendation is to contribute to the DjangoCon US website next year, but of course I really recommend that you complete Hacktoberfest, and even if it means going out of your comfort level, because I think you'll get a lot out of it. Thank you, everybody. Feel free to contact me. There's the useful resources link, and that's in my GitHub account. That's all I have. You're welcome.
Let's go ahead and shut this part down.
Okay.
Oops. Maybe it's starting. We can figure it out. So the good news is we can edit this out of the video later.
Okay.
We'll fix it in post. All right. Bye.